one of the reasons I like suggesting getting comfortable with solo episodes is because let's say you have a bunch of guests lined up and you have a guest interview on Monday and that episode's going to drop on Friday and the person no-shows you. I'd rather you do a solo episode than miss. So that's always an important skill to have, I think. I think it's important for you to have the ability to jump on and do solo episodes, maybe even if they're not your favorite. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode number 110, being a full-time podcaster. Is a lot different than I thought. Today, for episode number 111, how to never run out of solo episodes. Did I say episode 110 last week, 111 this week? I thought I said 1,000. I get confused, different podcasts. Last week was 110, this week is 111. How to never run out of solo episodes. So one of the things I hear often when I suggest that people do solo episodes, especially if somebody is doing a majority of guest interviews and they're trying to be the subject matter expert for their podcast, one of the best ways to do that is to do solo episodes, because then we have content for social media. We have solo episodes of you talking about the area of expertise. Tends to be pretty valuable in the long run. Well, often people will say, I'm just afraid I'm going to run out of stuff to talk about. What do I do? How do I make sure I never run out of stuff? Well, what if I start doing a solo podcast and then 2 months in, I made it 8 episodes in and I don't have anything to talk about? And I usually say, you're probably not going to run out of stuff. Sometimes you'll have blocks, but if you're looking for episodes, if you're experiencing life and you can use the experiences that you have as episodes, we'll talk about that a little bit today. But if you're on the lookout for podcast episodes, I think you'll probably find them over time. And when you have moments of inspiration, write down a bunch of ideas and then you can use those later. So over time, I've tried to figure out, well, how can I add value and help people avoid this problem? And I gave a speech recently, as you've heard me talk about, and this was one of the things that I described. So we've talked about this, I think we talked about this early on in the podcast. It's probably like, I don't know, maybe the first 5 episodes, something like that. First 10 episodes, I don't know. But one of the things I suggest for new podcasters all the time is you sit down and you write down what are the top 25 to 50 problems that your audience has. So you heard me talk about that before, but many of you might be new and maybe you haven't heard that far back. Again, I don't know what episode that was. It was a long time ago. But there's a deeper layer. Then I want you to write down the top 25 to 50 problems that those problems create. Now, if you have a podcast about comedy, if you have a podcast about sports, if you have a podcast that isn't necessarily about you being the subject matter expert in something, so this could be fitness, this could be business, this could be law, this could be architecture, this could be self-improvement, this could be many, many, many different things. It could be podcasting. It could be you coaching a sport or teaching a sport. Really, this is about someone who is a coach, teacher, or their podcast is about raising awareness towards something for their audience. I don't know how this would really work with sports. If you have a sports podcast, there's a lot of things that are going on in current events that you can always talk about. So top 25 to 50 problems that your audience deals with, top 25 to 50 problems that those problems create. So as an example, one of the top 25 to 50 problems I would say that my audience here at Podcast Growth U struggles with is probably imposter syndrome. So let's just say that's one topic, one thing, one problem. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I went back and looked at the data, and a couple of the highest hitting episodes had to do with mindset. They weren't just the tips and tricks and strategies. They were the mindset underneath it. So let's say imposter syndrome. Okay, cool. What are the top 25 to 50 problems that imposter syndrome creates for podcasters? Fear of doing solo episodes. That's one. Fear of sending messages to guests that they don't feel they're deserving of yet. That's another one. Fear of getting on other podcasts. Who am I to get on a podcast to be a guest? That's one. Fear of asking for money for my products or services eventually. fear of starting a Facebook group, fear of starting an email list, all of that stuff. Fear of promoting on social media, fear of telling people that I care about, that I have a podcast. You can see how that one problem just created 12 different episodes. So for you, whatever your space is, whatever the genre, the niche that your podcast is in, what are the top 25 to 50 problems that your ideal listener struggles with? And then what are the top 25 to 50 problems that those create? And then you have a plethora of potential podcast episodes. So maybe you're I don't know, let's do something we might do over at Next Level University. We might talk about someone who is struggling to be productive. So they're struggling to get everything that they want to get done. Okay, that's the problem. What are the problems underneath that? It's probably going to hurt their self-worth. It's probably going to hurt their self-belief. They're probably going to deal with procrastination a lot. They're probably going to get overwhelmed a lot. They're probably going to get burnt out a lot because they're not prioritizing the right things. They might feel stuck. They might not feel like they're making progress. They might feel unfulfilled. They might feel like they're not getting some of their needs met, right? And boom, 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 boom. And then all of those become potential episodes. So it's not that you have to say, all right, today I'm going to do an episode on productivity and getting a bunch of stuff done, and then I'm going to talk about burnout. You don't even have to connect the two. But if they deal with time management, if your audience deals with time management, what are some of the things that they might also struggle with as symptoms of that? And that's really where I would go. And I challenge people. I say 25 to 50 and then another 25 to 50. If you do that, you might have a year worth of content. You might have 52 episodes worth of content. That's something I do often. I always suggest that for clients. So that's one thing. Another thing, if you do have a podcast that is about something that you can connect current events into, you'll never run out of topics. So if you have a podcast that's about society and culture, politics is always going to be there. Maybe movies or whatever, music, the state of the country that you live in, whatever, right? There's a million different ways you can go with that. So that's another thought process, is attach your podcast in some way, shape, or form, if it's aligned, to current relevant events, whatever that means to you. Because there's always going to be stuff happening in the world, so theoretically you'll never run out of stuff to talk about. And then this is the one that I like the most. When I go through my day-to-day life, when I go out to dinner with my wife, when I'm on another podcast, when we go away, we do a day trip, we go on vacation, whatever it is, I go to the store, whatever it may be, go to the gym, I'm always trying to think of what is something I experienced today that I can turn into a podcast episode, because I already have the story. So a really good example, my wife and I went to see Twisters a couple weeks ago, and we're very much focused on saving money. We're trying to grow the business, so we're trying to eliminate non-essential expenses and just make as much money as possible in the business so we can continue pouring into the business and grow this whole thing. So my wife and I are very much trying to save money. And we have AAA, which is, I don't even know what AAA actually is. I don't know. I think it's roadside assistance, but also there's a bunch of other benefits. With AAA, you get $15 off of movie tickets or something. But you can't pre-purchase your ticket. So you buy 2 quote-unquote tickets, and then when you go to the theater, you decide what movie you want to watch, and you get your seats. And my wife said, hey, do you want me to use the AAA thing where we can save $15? Or do you want me to just get normal tickets because I don't know what's going to happen? The movie might be sold out. We might get there, and we might not be able to get seats. And I said, I'm willing to bet Twister's going to be sold out on a Friday night. I think we should probably just pay the extra, because I'd rather pay $15 for certainty and then get there and actually be able to see the movie. Because if we go and we don't see it, then we're going to end up leaving and spending more money to go do something else. So we ended up going with her idea, and I was fully supportive of that. We got to the movies. The only seats they had left were seats in the front row, and it was brutal looking up. It was very bad. Anybody who sat in the front row, I don't know how they saw any of the movie. So we decided to leave. Luckily, we were able to get a refund, and then we went last week and saw it, and we had much better seats because we purchased them in advance. That entire story became a story for Next Level U, and we talked about how sometimes you can kind of over necessitize saving money at the expense of your life experience. And that was a podcast episode in a nutshell. That came from an experience that I had. So that's another really good way to make sure that you always have topics, is to always, and again, I know this is a big ask, because for me it makes total sense, because I do this for a living, but I'm always kind of going through life thinking about lessons and stories.
Next Level University and Kevin is exactly where you need to be if you're a podcaster. When I first started out just a few months ago, I had no clue on the direction I was going. I was getting hustled by another company that was giving me not even close to the value that Kevin and Next Level U was giving me. They literally changed the trajectory of my podcast, have helped me out tremendously. They understand the clients. I promise you, you will not go wrong with dealing with Kevin and Next Level U. I'll see you there.
One of our mentors suggested that one time. He said, take a notebook, and every day you write down one lesson and the story that taught you that lesson. And then those ultimately can become episodes, depending on what you're doing. It really depends. So much of this is dependent on what is the genre, what is your audience like, what is the goal with a podcast. Obviously, it's very specific to what you're doing and how you're doing it. But I think the 25 to 50 and then the 25 to 50 is always going to be valuable. You could find a way to add that in there. If you can't, if you say, Kev, my podcast, it is not relevant to my podcast, I'm willing to bet the current events route probably is. Because if sports, politics, movies, music, those are all going to be current events anyway, most likely. That at least that'll always be a gimme. And if neither of those work, then your experiences is probably going to be a really good place to look. But you have to be very intentional. I am having a little bit, it's interesting. I am having a little bit of writer's block, for lack of better phrasing, when it comes to Next Level U. But that's because I haven't been doing as many experiences. So my wife and I went away for a day trip for our 2-year anniversary last weekend. And I still haven't sat down and written out what are the top lessons and stories I have from that. So I should really do that. I should probably do that, and that would help the writer's block, right? Sometimes you have to hear yourself give advice to take your own advice. So those are the 3 that I would really focus on. If you're somebody, this is the other thing too, if you're somebody who likes doing interviews, one of the reasons I like suggesting getting comfortable with solo episodes is because let's say you have a bunch of guests lined up and you have a guest interview on Monday and that episode's going to drop on Friday and the person no-shows you, I'd rather you do a solo episode than miss. So that's always an important skill to have, I think. I think it's important for you to have the ability to jump on and do solo episodes, maybe even if they're not your favorite. They weren't my favorite when I started Podcast Growth U Up. I didn't like doing these. I'm used to having a co-host. It's weird. It's weird to do them by myself. Now I really enjoy them. It's fun because I feel like I get to be, I don't want to say a different version of myself, but I get to go in different directions and there's nobody there to interrupt me. Not that Alan interrupts me. He does, but not that it's a big deal. It's just me here. And there's also a different level of pressure here. I feel like it's just me, and I have to hold a conversation for what is usually 20 minutes. What are we, 14 minutes in? It usually ends up being 20. So that's a whole nother thing. But I do think it's a good muscle to have. It's a good muscle to be able to flex because consistency is always going to be first. If you can stay consistent, you have a much higher likelihood of succeeding in the long run. So those are the 3 ways I would use to hopefully never run out of solo episodes. Another really good one, an added beneficial one, hopefully, is say you're, I don't know, let's say you're 50 episodes in. If you've done guest episodes in the past, you can always go back and then you can do my top 3 lessons from episode number 4 with this person. You can always do that. And this is another beautiful thing. You can technically talk about the same topic with a different lesson and a different story, mostly different story. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll go back and say, okay, what were we talking about in episode 150? What were we talking about? Oh, we were talking about ego and self-belief or whatever it is. All right, cool. Based on my understanding of that now, could I do a different episode with different stories? Similar lesson, because the lesson's kind of the point, but I could flip it to a place where you'd never know I was talking about the same thing. That's another way. In theory, the more episodes you do, the more opportunity you have to revisit old episodes. So that's a whole nother thing. I think that's always a good place to look. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but it's a good place to get inspiration. You can look back and see what you titled old episodes and try to remember them. I don't know how good your memory is. I cannot remember what we did 1,000 episodes ago. I can barely remember what we did 7 episodes ago because we do a lot. But it's always good to look back and say, oh yeah, I remember we did a bunch of episodes on growing pains. We could do an episode on growing pains. Yeah, for sure. And then I'll just figure out, okay, what are the growing pains? So there's a couple different ways to do it. One, you can literally think of the content and then turn that into an episode and figure out what to title it and all that. The other thing you can do is look at old episodes, see what you titled old episodes, and then do a very similar episode and then just change the title. I'm not saying to just copy and paste it. We have to add value, right? That's always the undertone of everything. If the episode's not valuable, it doesn't matter. But you're more evolved now. You've spoken more. You've podcasted more. You have more lessons. You have more stories. You have more experiences. You're probably a better storyteller. You can probably do that episode in a different way, but better. So that's another thing that I would suggest. All right, cool. So, exciting news. I don't know exactly. Probably over the next couple weeks, I need to do some legwork to make sure we can be consistent. But I will be starting a Facebook group. I already have it. It's already created. I just got to get things rolling and get it branded and all that, called Podcast Growth Nation. And my goal with Podcast Growth Nation will be to create a community of amazing podcasters, amazing, humble podcasters who want to learn more about podcasting. It's not going to be a group where you're going to advertise your stuff. That's not the goal, right? Just like it's not going to be a group where I advertise my stuff. It's going to be a community. Will it be my goal to add value in there every day? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. But the ultimate goal is a community, because I know podcasting can be lonely. I know podcasting can feel like you're not making any progress. So that's really the ultimate goals that I'm trying to help with that group. Will we have a day where maybe it's like Celebrate Success Saturday where everybody promotes their latest episode? Maybe. I got to see. I want to do some research and see. And I also want to know what's going to be best for you as a community member. Here's the thing. The people in the group are most likely not your clients, your potential clients, or your potential listeners. We talked about that early on where, yeah, you can go into Facebook groups that are filled with podcasters and then promote your podcast. But if everybody's in there to do it, nobody's going to go listen to your podcast. That's not the place to be promoting your podcast. It's not your audience. It's not your ideal listener avatar. I'm guessing this is going to be the same thing. So I don't know how beneficial that's actually going to be. I think it would probably make us feel good to say I promoted it to a new audience every week. Awesome. I just don't expect there to be almost any conversion, so it doesn't make sense to do it, really. I'd rather us figure out what is the most valuable content for us to be learning about. I'll be answering questions, anything. I'm happy to answer questions in there, whatever. Whatever's going to be the most valuable for the community, that's the ultimate goal. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Over the next couple weeks, that'll kind of be the call to action, and I'll have a link to join. There'll probably be a couple questions. It'll probably be, what's the name of your podcast? How long have you been podcasting? What are you hoping to learn here? Something like that. Just because I want to make sure that the community is valuable and aligned, and mostly those two things. Authentic. I want to make sure that there's nobody in there that's in there to try to grow their business or whatever. Not that that's a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But things can get wonky when that happens. I want to create a group of people who want to give value and they want to learn, and that's the ultimate goal. And hopefully you'll meet some friends, and who knows what'll happen. I'm really focused on going to more podcast events. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Podcast Movement in Washington, D.C. Who knows? When we grow the group, maybe we can have meetups in person. How cool would that be? You can meet up with other podcasters that listen to a similar podcast as you in person. And then maybe, I don't know how this would work, but maybe one day we'll get to the place where I can bring some of my gear, and then we could do, I could set up people to do in-person interviews with other people. I don't know. That might be a logistical nightmare, but I do like the idea of it. So, long story long, we're going to have a Facebook group called Podcast Growth Nation. It's already created. I just want to make sure I can get some posts in there and figure out how to systematize that to make sure we never miss. Because if I'm going to talk about consistency, I want to make sure I can practice it every single day. All right. What do I hope for you this week? I hope listeners are self-identifying, and I hope you're doing the work to get them to, because, again, that's going to be up to you. I hope you haven't settled on my audio is good enough, my video is good enough, these guests are good enough, my speaking is good enough. I hope you're really pushing for the next 1% improvement, always, always, always. For me, it's probably time for me to change my lights. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know what I'm talking about. If you're listening, which the majority of the audience does, you probably don't know what I'm talking about, but I have lights in my studio. It's probably time to change them. Been this way for, 5 months, maybe 6 months. So I'm always trying to change up something. So I hope that you are also focused on your next 1% improvement. Until next week, keep on crushing it, keep on podcasting, and we will talk to you then.